I stood behind the hallway arch, out of sight but not out of earshot, as my daughter's voice rang out over the clink of wine glasses. Once she's gone, this place'll need a full redo. Laughter followed, polite, hollow, complicit. My son said nothing. My granddaughter looked down at her plate. No one defended the house. No one defended me. After 47 years of cooking in this kitchen, nursing sick babies in this hallway, and keeping this roof from caving in, apparently I was just the thing standing in the way of better throw pillows. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Margaret had polished the silver the night before, not out of necessity, but habit. The same way she ironed linen napkins, even though everyone preferred paper. Her granddaughter Sophie had helped fold them, asking the occasional question about the old days, her voice half genuine, half bored, and entirely tender in that way teenagers sometimes are when they don't know they're being gentle. By noon, the house smelled of sage, browned butter, and something faintly lemony from the pie cooling on the windowsill. The table was set with maple leaf-shaped name cards. The mismatched chairs, 3 from the dining set, 1 folding, 2 from the garage, circled the table like family, uneven, worn, but holding. Everyone had shown up more or less on time. Even Lila. She arrived 20 minutes late. Wrapped in a taupe cashmere shawl that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, and trailing a breeze of peppermint perfume and vague apology. Well, Lila said, scanning the living room with a bright smile, nothing's changed here in 40 years. Once she's gone, this place'll need a full redo. The words floated like steam off a mug. Light, almost playful. Laughter followed. Evan chuckled. Nora gave a tight-lipped smile, and Sophie looked down at her plate, but Margaret felt it like a slap across the cheek. Not the kind that left a mark, but the kind that made your ears ring. She blinked, smiled. "I'll get more coffee," she said, lifting the pot though it was still 3/4 full. In the kitchen, the hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence she didn't know she needed. She gripped the counter and stared out the window. The tree in the backyard, once Evan's favorite climbing spot, had lost all its leaves. Its branches clawed at the gray November sky. Behind her, she could still hear the voices. Lila's sharp and smooth, like the edge of a ribbon. Nora's quieter, like someone trying not to step on glass. Margaret poured the coffee into a carafe, just for the excuse to linger. She didn't cry, not yet. She turned when she heard footsteps. Evan stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, the weight of the years between them thick in the air. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't meet his eyes. "Coffee's still hot," he nodded, said nothing. Which somehow hurt worse than the words. Back at the table, Sophie sat rigid. She hadn't said a word since the toast. She glanced toward the kitchen like she wanted to follow, then didn't. Her thumb traced the rim of her glass. She was still young enough to understand everything and say nothing. The silence stretched. Then, softly, Nora said, "People speak carelessly when they fear endings." The room fell still, the clink of a fork against china the only sound. Lila smiled tightly. "What does that mean?" Nora sipped her wine. "It means sometimes it's easier to talk about wallpaper than grief." Margaret returned just in time to catch the last line. She poured the coffee slowly, steady as ever. The air in the room had shifted, not cleared, not really, just shifted. Sophie leaned into her grandmother's side as she sat. Not obviously, just a gentle touch of shoulder to arm, but Margaret felt it, a kind of anchor or a warning, because something had cracked today, quietly, with no fanfare. But once something cracked, it never broke clean, it splintered. And the next splinter was already coming. The house was still, the kind of stillness that only comes the day after a holiday, when the platters are rinsed, the chairs pushed back, and the air left echoing with things said and not said. Margaret stood in the hallway, hand resting lightly on the brass doorknob of the upstairs office. The door stuck a little, just like it always had, and she gave it a practiced shove with her hip. Inside, the familiar scent of dust, cedar, and paper met her like an old friend that had started to feel like a ghost. She flicked on the desk lamp. Its soft amber light cast long shadows across the surface of the desk, illuminating the stack she'd placed there the night before. Folders tied with fading string, thick manila envelopes, a leather-bound ledger worn soft at the edges. The estate papers. She hadn't touched them in nearly 7 years, not since after Robert's funeral, when the attorney had come and gone, and all the signatures had bled together into a numb blur. It had been a different kind of quiet then, a silence that roared. She untied the string and opened the top folder. Her name was at the top, Margaret S. Caldwell. Below it, Robert's, his precise handwriting still present on the original draft copies. A strange pang twisted in her chest. Not grief exactly, not anymore. More like the ache of something too familiar to cry over. The documents were too clean, too final. They didn't account for how things had shifted, how the family had drifted like tectonic plates, slow and quiet but devastating beneath the surface. They didn't reflect how Sophie had become her shadow, how Evan had pulled back, how Nora had stepped forward, and certainly not how Lila had become more brittle, more biting every year. One clause mentioned the house, to be sold, proceeds divided equally. The line floated on the page, stark and clinical, as if this home, this place of birthdays and snow days and slow dances in the kitchen, could ever be equal to anything. Margaret exhaled sharply and reached for her phone. It took only 2 rings. "Daniel, it's Margaret Caldwell. I think I need to revisit my documents." He answered in that calm, measured tone of his, part lawyer, part friend. "Of course, Margaret. Do you want to come in, or should I come to you?" "I think I'd rather keep this quiet, at least for now." A pause. Then, "Understood. I can stop by tomorrow afternoon." She hung up and sat back, fingers drumming lightly on the desk. The clock on the bookshelf ticked once, twice. A slow kind of resolve settled into her spine. Later that evening, Nora stepped into the room, her arms full of folded laundry. She didn't say anything at first, just glanced at the desk, at the folders, at her mother's face. "You're allowed to protect peace," she said gently, setting down a sweater. "Not just property." Margaret didn't look up. Funny how hard that is to remember sometimes. Together they sifted through the documents again. Margaret pulled out a pad and began a new list. Not of assets, but of items that hummed with memory. The battered music box Sophie had always wound before bed. The copper mixing bowl her father gave her on her wedding day. The pressed violet Robert had hidden in her cookbook the spring she was pregnant with Evan. She wrote beside each one, not who deserved it, but who would understand it. And then she turned the page. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of splitting everything down to the decimal, we put a portion toward something shared, a fund, a foundation, something that actually lasts?" Nora didn't answer right away, but her eyes warmed. "That sounds like you." Margaret nodded once, then kept writing. By the time she closed the folder, the air in the room felt different. Not light, not yet, but cleaner. Outside, wind brushed against the windows. The branches of the backyard tree tapped lightly against the glass. And downstairs, Lila's voice rose, sharp, insistent, unmistakable. "She's changing things. I know she is. And none of you are going to stop her." Evan stood by the kitchen window, his coffee cooling untouched in his hand. The hum of the refrigerator buzzed like a warning. His mother's voice, muffled from upstairs, had quieted, but Lila's hadn't. Her words still echoed, hot and sharp. "She's changing things. I know she is." He stared at the backyard, where the tree limbs shook under a steady wind. The same tree he'd climbed in jeans too short and sneakers with holes, yelling for his dad to watch. His stomach turned. Upstairs, footsteps creaked along the hallway. Then Margaret descended, folder in hand. She looked calm, not secretive, not triumphant, just resolved, too resolved. Evan set his mug down too hard. "Hey," he said, not moving from the kitchen doorway. "Can we talk for a second?" She paused mid-step. "Of course." He led her to the breakfast nook, the one with the window seat and the faded floral cushions she refused to replace. She took a seat, hands still resting on the folder. He stayed standing, arms folded. It made him feel taller, though he wasn't. I heard Lila, he said. She thinks you're rewriting things. Margaret waited. He took a breath. Are you? She tilted her head. I'm revisiting the estate papers. Yes. Why now? Something tightened in his voice. Not anger, not yet, but a crack of fear. I hadn't updated them since your father passed, she said gently. It's time. That's not what this is about. Margaret's brows rose ever so slightly. Then tell me what it's about. He hesitated. You're not cutting anyone out, are you? Her expression didn't change, but her hands did still. Evan, she said carefully, why would you think that? He looked past her toward the kitchen sink, toward the counter where the mail still sat unopened. You've been quiet. Closed off. Now suddenly there are documents and lawyers, and Nora's involved and… He broke off. I just need to know if something's happening behind closed doors. I'm not shutting anyone out, she said. I'm clarifying what matters. That's not the same thing. He opened his mouth, but another voice cut in. Oh, for God's sake, Lila snapped, stepping into the room like a gust of perfume and resentment. Nobody's after your money, Margaret. This whole house is like a museum anyway. You think we're fighting over doilies? Margaret didn't flinch. I never said you were, but you're acting like we are. Evan stepped back, blinking. Lila. No, really. I've spent my entire life listening to you and Nora pretend like you're better than me because I bought throw pillows instead of saving coupons. Now you're both hiding in corners, making decisions like the rest of us, our vultures circling. Sophie stood in the hallway, invisible and absorbing every word. Margaret rose slowly, her face composed, her voice level. I've asked for privacy. That doesn't mean secrecy. If you want to know what I'm doing, ask. Don't eavesdrop and assume. Lila's laugh was bitter. You're right. Let's all pretend this isn't about control. Sophie moved, a whisper of motion behind the doorframe. She caught her grandmother's eye, just for a second. Something passed between them. Not pity, not fear. Recognition. Margaret turned back to her children. I'm tired, she said simply. Let's continue this another time. She stepped past them, folder in hand, and climbed the stairs slowly, not as a retreat. As a boundary, at the top she paused. Her hand hovered over the banister as she heard Evan's voice, low and unsure. She really might do it, he said. And then Lila, colder than ever. Then maybe we deserve it. The alert buzzed on her phone while she was sorting old recipe cards. Robert's handwriting faded, her own notes in the margins. She almost ignored it. But the name caught her eye. Sophie had tagged her in a photo from Thanksgiving. The caption was simple. Grateful, as always. It was the comment that stopped her. Lila. Let's hope she's as generous in death as she is with dessert. 31 likes. Margaret stared at the screen, blinking. The air in the room thinned. Not because the words were cruel exactly, she'd heard worse, but because they were casual, public. Lila had reduced her to a punchline with the flick of a thumb. She set the phone down on the windowsill. For the first time in days, she didn't reach for coffee or a to-do list or the estate folder. She just sat. The ticking clock sounded louder than usual. Later that afternoon, she canceled brunch with Evan. Said she wasn't feeling well. He didn't press. She could hear the relief in his voice. She skipped the Wednesday volunteer shift at the library. No explanation. She stopped picking up when Lila called. 2 rings, then 3, then silence. It wasn't spite. It was preservation, Nora noticed first. They sat together on the back porch, bundled in scarves, hands wrapped around mugs of ginger tea. Margaret had pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders even though it wasn't particularly cold. You're pulling away, Nora said gently, watching her mother with eyes that saw more than Margaret wished. I'm tired, she said. That's not new. Margaret smiled weakly. No, but the reason is. Nora said nothing, let it land. After a long pause, Margaret spoke again. I saw the comment on Sophie's post. Nora's jaw tightened. I reported it, for what it's worth. Margaret shook her head. It's not the post. It's the fact that she didn't even think I'd see it. Or care. Like I'm some institution. A thing, not a person. You are a person, Nora said. You just forgot how to act like one. You've spent so long giving. You forgot how to keep anything for yourself. Margaret stared out at the brittle backyard grass. Maybe I need to teach people how to treat me, not with more documents, with distance. The next day, she saw Daniel again. They met at a cafe just off Main Street. He wore his usual navy pea coat, brought her a ginger scone without asking. She slid the updated folder across the table. I think I'm done with the edits, she said, but I'm not done with the situation. He nodded. You're within your rights to draw lines. I don't want to punish anyone. Then don't, but you can protect your peace without turning it into a war. She nodded, quietly grateful that he didn't push, that he didn't lean on legalese, that he didn't call her dramatic for being wounded by a digital jab. He just listened. That night, she signed up for something on a whim, a workshop at the senior center. Emotional inheritance, what we leave beyond the will. She walked in with a notebook and a scarf pulled high on her neck. The room smelled like peppermint hand lotion and institutional coffee. 20 folding chairs, 2 instructors, 1 flickering overhead light. A woman named Grace, with bright white hair and a voice like smoke, spoke first. People think wills are about property, she said. But what we leave behind is mostly emotional, guilt, favoritism, resentment, or if we're careful, clarity, peace. Margaret sat straighter in her chair. The woman turned to the room. Anyone want to share what they're really afraid of leaving behind? Margaret's pen hovered over the page. She didn't speak. But in her head, one answer rang clear. Regret. She looked around the room, strangers all, and felt something she hadn't in a long time. Relief. Until her phone buzzed in her purse. A text from Sophie. Grandma, I think you need to know what Lila's planning. The doorbell rang at 3:18 p.m., exactly the time Sophie's bus usually dropped off down the hill. Margaret didn't move at first. She stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, lemon zest clinging to her fingertips, from a failed attempt at reinventing her mother's old cookie recipe. Another chime. Then the familiar rhythm, one long, one short. Sophie's knock. Margaret dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. Opened the door. Sophie stood there, backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks pink from the wind. Her mouth set in a line that tried to be casual but didn't quite land. Hey, Grandma. Hey, baby. I had a half day. Mom had a call. I told her I'd just come here. Margaret stepped aside without asking. Sophie stepped in without hesitation. The house felt fuller instantly. They ended up in the den, where the old gas heater hummed in the corner and the sofa cushions always slumped toward the middle. Sophie dropped her backpack and flopped down sideways, legs hanging over the armrest. You okay? She asked suddenly, like it had been waiting behind her lips all day. Margaret sat in her chair across from her. I will be. Sophie picked at the edge of a throw pillow. I didn't like what Mom wrote. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You saw it? She made me tag her in the post. So yeah, I saw the comment come in. Margaret leaned back. It's all right. No, it's not, Sophie said. It's not even funny. It was just mean. Silence fell for a moment. Then Sophie looked up again, this time more carefully. Grandma, why does this house matter so much to you? Margaret smiled, not defensively, not wistfully, just genuinely. Because it remembers, Sophie blinked. Margaret nodded toward the fireplace, then toward the far wall. See that crack in the baseboard? That was from when your Uncle Evan built a rocket out of PVC pipe and tried to launch it inside. Scared the dog so badly she wouldn't come back in the house for a week. Sophie laughed. Seriously? Margaret pointed to the corner behind the bookcase. Your grandfather painted that wall himself. It took 3 coats because the first 2 were the wrong color and he was too proud to admit it. Sophie followed her gaze. I never noticed. No one does. But I do. Margaret's voice softened. We picked out that wallpaper together. Spent 6 hours in a hardware store in Roanoke, arguing over whether herringbone was too busy. And you know what? We both hated what we ended up with, but we never changed it, because it felt like us. Sophie's face shifted, somewhere between awe and grief. I don't want you to feel like you have to give it up, she said quietly. Just because people are fighting about it. Margaret rose, walked toward the kitchen. Come here, she called back. Sophie followed her in, puzzled, until she saw the cookie dough on the counter. I thought you gave up sugar, she said. I gave up perfection, Margaret replied, but not cookies. They rolled dough together in silence, the good kind. Margaret showed her how to keep the edges from cracking. Sophie added extra cinnamon to one batch, just to experiment. The oven warmed the kitchen until the windows fogged. They talked while the cookies baked. About the swing that used to hang from the maple tree. About the storm that blew out the back window in '89. About the raccoon that nested in the attic for 2 entire winters before Robert finally sealed it out. And then, as the scent of browned butter and vanilla filled the room, Margaret said it. Homes are living things, Sophie. They breathe. They creak. They remember. We don't just pass down walls and ceilings. We pass down stories, lessons, warnings. Sophie looked at her with new eyes. So, what happens if you sell it? Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out the kitchen window. The tree out back was bare again, its limbs still against the afternoon light. I don't know yet, she said, but I do know this. I'm going to make something, a record, not of stuff, of meaning, a scrapbook? More than that, a memory book, for all of you. So no one has to wonder why something mattered, or what happened here before them. Sophie nodded slowly, like she was memorizing the words. They pulled the cookies from the oven, the tray bending slightly in the middle like it always had. Sophie ate one while it was still too hot and burned the roof of her mouth. Margaret laughed, reaching for the milk. In that moment, something opened, quietly, like a door pushed just enough to let the light in. Then Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie's number, but this time it wasn't Sophie who had typed it. Unknown login attempt on your account. Your security settings have been changed. Apple ID. Margaret stared at the screen. The warmth of the kitchen dulled. Her fingers went cold. Sophie, she said slowly, voice sharp now, have you been on my phone? Sophie's brows furrowed. No, why? Margaret turned the phone toward her. Sophie's eyes widened. That's not me. The church basement still smelled faintly of lemon polish and burnt coffee from Sunday's service. Margaret sat at the end of the folding table, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Across from her, Evan adjusted his watch for the 3rd time. Lila scrolled on her phone. Nora poured water into paper cups just to fill the silence. Pastor Lewis entered last, tall, unhurried, the kind of man whose voice carried comfort even when he said nothing at all. He pulled out a chair beside Margaret and sat without ceremony. I appreciate you all coming, he said. Family meetings aren't easy, especially when things are raw. Lila muttered, that's one word for it. Evan shot her a look, but said nothing. Margaret watched the steam rise from the coffee maker in the corner. It hissed quietly, as if it too wanted to be part of the conversation. Pastor Lewis folded his hands. Why don't we start with why we're here? Evan cleared his throat. I think I should. Margaret's eyes found him, calm, waiting. He stared at his hands. I didn't speak up during Thanksgiving. When Lila made that remark, his voice cracked slightly and he steadied it. I laughed, and I shouldn't have. It wasn't funny. I just didn't want to make a scene. Margaret said nothing. He looked up. I've been thinking about that. About how quiet I've been. About what that's cost you. The room softened a little. Even the fluorescent light seemed less harsh. Evan went on, words tumbling now. I've been under a lot of pressure lately. Clients pulling projects. Lila worried about bills, appearances. You know how she is about appearances, and I guess I wanted to keep things smooth, keep the peace, even if it meant being a coward. Margaret's lips curved faintly, not forgiveness yet, but something close. You know, she said, kindness doesn't cost design fees. Lila looked up from her phone. What's that supposed to mean? Margaret turned to her. It means you can't buy grace, Lila. You practice it. Lila exhaled sharply, her composure cracking for just a second. I know what I said, and I know it was cruel. I was angry. You were cutting us out. I was protecting what matters, Margaret interrupted softly. That's not the same thing, Pastor Lewis interjected then, his voice a steadying rhythm. Sometimes protection and exclusion look alike from the outside, but the intention behind them makes all the difference. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, just heavy. The sound of truth landing without resistance. Nora broke it gently. Maybe this isn't something a will can fix. Pastor Lewis nodded. No paper ever could. He turned to Margaret. Would you be open to a few counseling sessions? With everyone, I'll mediate. Margaret hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, but only if everyone shows up. All eyes shifted to Lila. She took a breath, slow and shallow. Fine, she said. I'll come, once. That's a start, the pastor said, smiling faintly. Evan leaned back in his chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a little. Nora reached for his hand under the table. He didn't pull away. Pastor Lewis rose. We'll begin next Tuesday evening. I'll send reminders. As they gathered their things, Daniel stepped into the doorway, his briefcase tucked under his arm. His timing, impeccable as always, felt intentional, grounding. Sorry to intrude, he said quietly. I just came from the office. Margaret, your documents are ready. He set a manila envelope on the table and slid a single page toward her. I've drafted something to accompany the will. A neutral letter, explains intentions, not distributions. Sometimes it helps calm nerves. Lila's eyes flicked toward it, wary. Margaret took the page. The letter began simply. To my family, what I leave behind is not a ledger, but a lesson. She stopped reading. Folded it gently. Thank you, Daniel. He nodded. You don't have to decide today. The group began to disperse, Nora and Evan in quiet conversation, Pastor Lewis collecting notes. Lila hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at Margaret. For the first time, there was something uncertain in her expression. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the faintest hint of doubt in her own righteousness. When the room finally emptied, Margaret remained seated, Daniel still beside her. I think that went as well as it could, he said. Margaret nodded, eyes on the folded letter. Maybe. Then her phone buzzed on the table. She turned it over. New login from unknown device. Accessed shared files. Estate revisions. Final. Her hand froze. Daniel, she said slowly, did you open this from your end? He shook his head. The hum of the coffee maker filled the silence again. Steady, relentless, and somehow accusatory. The second counseling session began with no coffee, no chatter, just silence. They met in the church library this time, warmer than the basement, walls lined with battered devotionals and hymnals no one had touched in years. A small lamp flickered in the corner, casting uneven light across the long wooden table where Margaret sat beside Pastor Lewis, the folded legacy letter untouched before her. Evan came first, then Nora. Lila arrived last. No sunglasses, no shawl, no dramatic sigh, just her, in jeans and a charcoal cardigan, hair pulled back like she couldn't be bothered to style it. Her face was bare, of makeup, of armor. Sophie came too this time, at Margaret's invitation. She sat in a low armchair by the corner window, silent but present. A quiet observer as the generations circled one another like orbiting planets, trying to find gravity again. Pastor Lewis opened gently. Margaret, would you like to speak first? She shook her head. I think someone else should. A long pause. Then Lila cleared her throat. Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It cracked. I wasn't trying to be cruel, she said. About the house, or the will, or the post. Evan looked at her, surprised. Lila pressed on. It was a bad joke, but it came from somewhere. Not greed, insecurity. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hand twitched against the arm of the chair. Lila swallowed. When you grow up poor, like we did, when I did, old things don't feel comforting. They feel like struggle. Hand-me-downs, stains you scrubbed that never really came out. Cold floors in winter, broken heat. One bar of soap that had to stretch through December. She paused. Her jaw tensed. I spent my entire adulthood trying to get out from under that feeling. I bought things, new things, pretty things. I made a life that looked good from the outside because I didn't know how to feel good on the inside. And when I walk into this house, all I see is everything I tried to escape. Sophie's breath caught audibly. Nora looked down. Evan wiped at the corner of his eye and pretended it was nothing. Lila's voice softened. But I get it now. For you, Mom, this place means something completely different. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded once, her voice low. Then maybe we both cling to symbols, just different ones. Lila looked at her, really looked. I'm sorry, she said. Tears welled suddenly in her eyes, uncontrolled, unguarded. She swiped at them fast, but not fast enough. I know I've made you feel like the enemy, but the truth is, I've just never known where I fit in. I wasn't like Nora, always capable, or Evan, always gentle. I was the sharp one, the loud one, and I guess I thought being sharp would cut a space for me. Instead, it just left me outside. Margaret reached across the table and laid her hand over Lila's. No lecture, no flourish, just presence. None of you were ever outside, she said softly, but I should have opened the door wider. Evan exhaled. Well, that's about 10 years of therapy packed into 10 minutes. They laughed, awkwardly at first, but then warmly. The air in the room shifted, not into harmony, but into honesty. That was enough. Sophie sat up straighter in the corner. Her voice was small but steady. I like seeing you all like this. Talking like people. Lila smiled at her daughter, eyes still glassy. Pastor Lewis leaned forward, folding his hands. There's something sacred about a family that can sit in truth without retreating. He looked around the room. So let's build from here, not just with words, but with something shared. What would it look like to create together, not just argue over what gets divided? No one spoke for a beat. Then Margaret turned toward Daniel's envelope, still resting on the table. She tapped it once, then turned her eyes to her children. I have an idea, she said. They waited. But before she could speak it aloud, her phone buzzed again. A new notification. Security alert. Attempted edits blocked on shared file. Legacy letter, docs. Margaret's blood went cold. She turned the screen so only Sophie could see. Sophie leaned in, whispered, They're trying to change your words. Margaret stood in the middle of the upstairs guest room, arms folded over her chest, scanning the walls like a general surveying a battlefield. The morning light slanted across faded floral wallpaper that had curled at the edges like old paperbacks. A fine layer of dust clung to the baseboards. The room smelled of time, cedar, starch, and faint lavender from a sachet no one had touched in years. I'll agree to repaint, she said slowly, on one condition. Lila, standing beside her with a color swatch fan and half a dozen Pinterest screenshots in hand, looked up. Margaret pointed to the wall. We preserve the heart, not erase it. Lila tilted her head. Meaning? We don't cover what matters just because it's old. We choose what stays with intention, not trend. Lila nodded. Fair. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchpad in her lap, jotting notes. I'm going to write about this for my American Heritage essay, she said. About legacy through space. Like what we choose to keep versus what we let go. Margaret smiled. You're not going to mention that your grandmother made you sand drywall, are you? Only if you make me, Sophie grinned. Evan walked in holding a power sander, goggles perched on his head like a crown he didn't ask for. I figured I'd tackle the window frames first, he said. Dad built these with hand tools. I remember him cussing for hours about the angles not lining up. Margaret chuckled. And he'd blame the tools every time. Evan ran a hand along the frame. They're still solid, just need care. The four of them worked in a rhythm that wasn't quite graceful. But it was real. Evan sanding. Margaret and Lila stripping wallpaper in sections. Sophie snapping photos and scribbling captions. Lila cursed once when a strip tore unevenly. Margaret didn't scold her. She just handed over a stepladder and said, Top corner's trickier. By afternoon, the air was thick with dust and paint fumes. They opened the windows, let in the chill. The sound of jazz filtered through Sophie's Bluetooth speaker. Soft horns, brushed drums, giving the work an almost cinematic pace. Lila stood back at one point, holding up two color samples side by side. What do you think? She asked Margaret. The shades were near identical, a warm, muted sage and a deeper, more nostalgic olive. Margaret pointed to the sage. That one. Your father called it porch green. It was the color of our first kitchen walls. Lila blinked. Seriously? That's kind of perfect. Sophie looked up. Did you pick that on purpose? No, Lila said, surprised. I just liked how it felt. Margaret said nothing, but her smile deepened. Later, Nora arrived with a tray of lemon bars and a thermos of chai she'd made herself. She stepped inside, froze mid-threshold, and broke into a slow grin. "Look at you," she said, blending eras. Margaret took a step back from the wall. "We're trying to paint peace, or at least start the undercoat." Sophie held up her phone. "Can I get a picture of you three with the brushes?" Lila groaned. "Do I have paint in my hair?" "Yes," Evan said. "Yes," Nora added. "You look fine," Margaret told her. They posed anyway, awkward but real. Lila in her smudged sweater, Evan with dust on his cheek, Nora holding a paintbrush like a conductor's baton. Margaret stood between them, not touching but close. Present, click. The room smelled of lemon bars and primer, the kind of scent that meant something was beginning. Sophie lowered the camera and paused, staring at something in the corner of the room. "Grandma," she said, pointing. "Was this always here?" They all turned. Tucked behind the old wardrobe, half hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a narrow metal box. Margaret's breath caught. Lila crouched first, tugging it free. Dust rose in a cloud. The box was dented, cool to the touch. Margaret took it with both hands, slowly, reverently. She knew this box. Robert's handwriting was on the label. "For when it matters." Daniel sat at Margaret's dining table, glasses sliding low on his nose, eyes scanning the documents with that deep, unflinching focus he wore like a second skin. Outside, late November light softened the edges of the afternoon, warm but thin, like a blanket that no longer fully covers. The metal box sat open between them, its contents now catalogued and neatly laid out. Yellowing birth certificates, a deed signed in Robert's looping hand, a letter dated 1986, never sent, addressed to Evan, and folded beneath them all, tucked in the lining like a hidden spine, was a handwritten estate addendum. Robert's draft, never notarized but clear. It was his wish that the house be passed to someone who remembered the sound of it, not just the value. Margaret had read it 3 times before saying a word. Then she'd picked up her pen. Now Daniel looked up, blinking slowly. "You sure about this?" Margaret nodded. "Yes. You're naming Evan and Sophie as joint inheritors of the house. No division, no buyouts." "Correct. You understand that could get complicated. She's still a minor, he's still under pressure." Margaret smiled faintly. "And yet they're the only two who've consistently seen the house as more than real estate." Daniel tilted his head. "Why not include Nora? She has her piece, and she helped me find mine." Margaret paused. "She doesn't need a deed to stay close." Daniel nodded, then flipped to the next page. "And this is new." He held up a freshly typed paragraph. "A dedicated design grant, named in Lila Caldwell's honor for students restoring historic homes with intention and equity." Margaret sipped her tea, watching the steam rise. She loved design because it let her rewrite the story, she said. "I want her to know she can add beauty without erasing roots." Daniel looked at her for a long time, then leaned back and exhaled. "You turned hurt into heritage." Margaret said nothing, but the way her shoulders dropped slightly told the truth. This, right here, made her lighter. She took a clean sheet of stationery and uncapped her pen. "What's that?" Daniel asked. She looked at him. "The part that can't go in a will." "Dear ones," she wrote slowly. "When I'm gone, what matters won't be what I left behind. It'll be what we faced, together. The words we softened. The doors we didn't close." She didn't finish it all right then, but the words came easier than she expected. Outside, wind rustled through the bare maple branches. Inside, the old clock chimed 4. Daniel rose, packed the papers, and slid the finalized draft into his briefcase with a satisfying click. "Do I send copies now?" "Not yet," Margaret said. "Let me give it to them myself. When the time's right?" He nodded and left without fanfare, the quiet echo of the closing door ringing gently in the room. Margaret stood, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. She took the legacy letter, Daniel's clean, neutral draft, and tucked it into a linen envelope. Then she opened a drawer and slid it into the back of the safe behind the dish towels. One copy, hers to give. She turned off the kitchen light, ready to rest, but her phone buzzed. Another alert. Access denied. Attempted override of shared permissions on legacy letter.docs. Origin, Evan's home network. Margaret froze. Then slowly, very slowly, she sat back down and opened her laptop. Thanksgiving came early that year, or maybe it just felt early. The leaves had already browned and dropped, leaving the yard bare and open. But inside Margaret's house, warmth returned like a memory rediscovered. The kitchen pulsed with life, clinking silver, the hum of the oven, someone playing Ella Fitzgerald on low from the dining room speaker. Margaret stood at the counter, folding linen napkins into soft triangles. She moved slowly, with care. The final touches mattered. There were no place cards this time, just names everyone already knew. The guest room, once peeled, patched, and painted, now glowed with soft lamplight and the scent of lavender and cedar. A single-frame photo sat on the side table. Robert sanding a deck in sweatpants, sunburned and grinning. Sophie had found it while sorting boxes. Across the hall, the old bathroom faucet no longer leaked. At 3:30, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Lila holding the turkey. "Smells like redemption," Margaret said, smiling. Lila blinked. "I added orange zest to the glaze. Hope that's okay." Margaret stepped aside. "We're in uncharted waters now. Let's keep rowing." Inside, the family gathered slowly. Nora with her chai and calm. Evan with 2 bottles of wine and a new nervousness in his eyes. Sophie clutching a notebook, her thumb tucked in the spine. The air felt charged, not with fear, but awareness. Everyone knew this wasn't just a meal. It was a reclaiming. Lila moved stiffly in the kitchen, checking the temperature of the rolls, rearranging the serving spoons twice. "You can sit," Margaret said gently, stepping beside her. "The table's fine. I just want it to be right." "It already is." At 5 o'clock sharp, they took their seats. No one reached for their phones. Margaret poured the wine herself. The clink of glass against glass sounded like a benediction. She stood slowly, raising her glass. The room hushed. "To what lasts," she said. "Not what we inherit, what we understand. To what remains when we choose to listen, even when it hurts. And to the walls that remember us kindly." They raised their glasses, quiet, reverent, even Lila. And then, without prompting, Sophie stood. "I wrote something," she said, voice smaller than usual. "For my essay, but also for here." She unfolded the page with both hands. Her eyes flicked to Margaret, then down. "This house doesn't echo like others do. It hums, like memory warming its hands by the fire. Each floorboard is a fingerprint, each doorframe a measure of who grew tall enough to reach it. There's laughter in the dust, and grief folded into the curtains. This house taught me the difference between old and sacred, and the people inside taught me how to carry it forward. Silence, full and whole." Evan cleared his throat, blinking hard. Lila wiped under her eyes with a napkin she tried to pretend she hadn't used. Nora reached across the table and took Sophie's hand. Margaret was the last to speak. "That poem is a better legacy than anything I've written." No one laughed, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. They served themselves slowly, no chaos, no overlapping jabs. Just food passed hand to hand, roast turkey, rosemary potatoes, a bowl of collard greens with garlic that Sophie insisted on making herself. They didn't toast a second time, they didn't need to. Instead of jokes, they shared stories, memories long tucked away. Evan spoke of Robert teaching him to ride a bike, yelling, "You're doing it," long after he'd let go. Nora shared a memory of Margaret sneaking her cake batter to lick when Robert wasn't looking. Even Lila spoke, haltingly, about being 6 years old and hiding in Margaret's closet during thunderstorms. Sure, it was the safest place on earth. At one point, Margaret excused herself quietly and went into the kitchen, letting the voices rise behind her like music. She reached for a dish towel and paused at the drawer. She glanced toward the safe, still locked, still hers. But when she turned back, she found Sophie in the doorway. "Grandma." "Yes?" I don't think Evan tried to change the file. Margaret studied her granddaughter's face. "Then who did?" Sophie hesitated, and said the name neither of them had spoken aloud in weeks. "Uncle Brian." The house was silent again by nightfall. Dishes washed, leftovers stored, the air faintly scented with sage and citrus. The hum of the refrigerator filled the pauses where conversation had once lived. Margaret had gone upstairs early, claiming she was full to the brim, though everyone knew she meant something different. Downstairs, Evan lingered in the dining room, tracing the rim of his wineglass with one finger. The letter sat in front of him, ivory paper folded cleanly, Margaret's handwriting neat but unmistakably human. Lila and Sophie sat across from him, the candle between them guttering low. "Do you want to?" Lila asked, her voice small. Evan nodded. "She asked me to." He unfolded the page carefully, the sound like tearing silk. His throat tightened as he began to read. "My dear ones, if you're reading this, it means I've done what I always hoped. I've left something behind that isn't just things. The house is yours to share, not sell. It's not an inheritance, it's an agreement. Between you, between generations. Keep it alive the way we tried to keep each other, imperfectly, but with love. If walls could speak, they'd tell you that order was my shield. I thought neatness meant safety, but what I've learned, too late perhaps, is that kindness is the better architect. Care for each other better than I cared for order. Let laughter be louder than control. Let memory outlast money. And when it's hard, when you don't know who deserves what, remember this. Nothing we owned was ever the point. It's who stood beside us while we built it that matters. Be gentle with one another. And don't repaint the kitchen. That green earned its place." "Mom." Evan stopped. His voice caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Lila pressed her hand over her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. "She really said that," she whispered, half smiling through it. "She really meant it." Sophie wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "Grandma believes in us," she said softly, "even after everything." Evan folded the letter slowly, smoothing the edges as if closing a prayer. "Then we owe her the same." Lila reached across the table, hesitating only once before setting her hand over his. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a performance, just connection. Sophie got up and fetched the family scrapbook from the sideboard, the same one Margaret had started decades ago. The cover was cracked leather, the corners soft from handling. She flipped to a blank page near the back and pressed the folded letter down gently. "No frame," she said. "It should stay where people actually look." Evan nodded. "Agreed." Lila leaned closer. "We should add photos. From today. From when we painted. From when we stopped pretending we weren't a mess." Sophie grinned. "That's kind of the point, isn't it?" The three of them sat in the dim kitchen light, the scrapbook open before them like an altar. Outside, a cold wind brushed the windows. Inside, the walls, old, painted, patched, seemed to breathe again. Evan exhaled, long and quiet. "She left peace in every room," he said. But before anyone could reply, the clock on the mantel chimed once, and a soft ding came from Evan's phone. He glanced down. Incoming email. Legacyletter.docs. Modified copy saved by unknown user. The sender line read, "From brian.caldwell.archives.icloud.com." Evan's smile faltered. "Dad?" Sophie asked. "What is it?" He looked up, eyes suddenly distant, haunted. Someone's rewriting her again. Rain had come in the night, steady and cold, tapping like fingertips against the window panes. By morning, it was gone, but the evidence lingered. Damp plaster in the ceiling corner above the pantry, a soft drip near the mudroom door, and the distinct familiar scent of old wood breathing in moisture. Margaret stood in the hallway with her sleeves rolled up and a canvas tool bag at her feet. She wore her old college sweatshirt, now threadbare at the elbows, and her eyes held that tight, determined gleam Evan hadn't seen in years. "It's worse than it was in the spring," she said, peering up at the water stain that spidered across the ceiling. Evan adjusted the ladder legs on the uneven tile. "Yeah, I think the flashing's rusted through. We'll need to patch and seal before the next front comes in." Margaret smirked. "You always wanted to fix things with patches. Remember the basement window in Illinois?" He chuckled. "Hey, duct tape bought us 6 months. 6 terrifying months." The ladder wobbled slightly as he climbed, and she steadied it instinctively, fingers gripping the rail like she was anchoring something more than aluminum. From the kitchen, Lila's voice floated in. "I come bearing gifts, Tools and sugar. She entered holding a red thermos in one hand and a battered toolbox in the other. Her hair was piled in a messy bun, sweater sleeves pulled over her knuckles. You two look like a Home Depot ad for emotionally repressed parents. Margaret laughed, a real one, unguarded. I take offense. I'm extremely expressive. Evan raised an eyebrow. Only when driving. I'm passionate about turn signals, she said, accepting the thermos. Don't judge me. Lila passed out steaming mugs. Okay, team, we're fixing a leak. I Googled things. I brought wrenches I can't name. Let me be helpful. Evan grinned, handing her a headlamp. Strap in, rookie. There's insulation to offend your soul. What followed was messy, honest work. Between the attic and the crawl space, the three of them moved with a rhythm not unlike a song. Passing nails, catching jokes midair, navigating the awkward angles of a house built long before modern codes. At one point, Lila cursed loud enough to make the pipes blush. My God, who designed this roofline? Evan wiped sweat from his brow. A drunk Puritan, probably. Margaret, flat on her back tightening a hose clamp, muttered. And his emotionally stunted brother handled the ductwork. They laughed, and for a moment, it wasn't about legacy or grief or the strange, cold message that had come the night before. It was about three people repairing a thing they all still wanted to stand. It was Lila who found the box. She'd reached behind a support beam in the attic, trying to yank out what she thought was old insulation. Instead, her fingers brushed cool metal, thin, rust-dusted, wrapped in a flannel shirt that had clearly belonged to someone long dead. Guys, she said, sitting back on her heels, you need to see this. Inside the box, a stack of letters, faded ink on cream paper bundled with a silk ribbon gone gray with age. On the top envelope, a single name, Ellen. Margaret sat cross-legged beside her, brushing dust from the first page. Her breath hitched softly as she read the date, 1943. Evan leaned over her shoulder. They're from the war. Lila held up one, its corner burned just slightly. They talk about ration books, about the garden behind the fence, about dancing barefoot in the rain. And this one mentions the house. Margaret's eyes shone. Even the house kept something for us. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, the old wood groaning gently beneath them as if waking from sleep. Downstairs, Sophie climbed the final step with her laptop under one arm. I brought sandwiches, she called. And possibly the worst idea I've ever had. She stopped short at the attic doorway, seeing them all huddled around the box, the letters fanned out like tarot cards. What is that? History, Lila said softly. Sophie stepped closer, her eyes wide. I was going to write my college essay about Grandma's letter, about the house, about what it meant to sit there last night and feel something shift. But this, she knelt, brushing a finger over the ribbon. This is part of it, too. Margaret looked at her granddaughter. Then write about the repair, the one we made. Sophie nodded slowly. Not just the house. Below them, a wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Evan turned toward the attic window, peering out across the yard. The trees bent under the gusts. Then the light on his phone blinked again. Another email. Same sender. Same subject, but this time a new attachment. He opened it. Legacy, letter, docs. Final version. Margaret saw his face, pale. Evan. He passed her the phone. She stared at the screen, then looked up at him, her mouth parting slightly. This isn't her writing. Behind them, the attic floor creaked, and a fourth mug of cocoa, untouched, sat cooling on the stair. It started with a short breath. Margaret had come downstairs after dinner, cheeks pale, hand pressed to her side like she was holding something in. She'd waved off Sophie's concern, blaming it on the paint fumes from the attic. But an hour later, she was hunched over the kitchen sink, her mouth trembling, her fingers slick with cold sweat. Evan drove her to the ER in silence, both of them pretending not to feel the weight of the unspoken. The roads were dark and wet from earlier rain, streetlights blurring through the windshield like memories too soft to hold. In the hospital room, everything smelled like bleach and plastic, and time stretched thin. The machines beeped at intervals that made conversations feel like interruptions. Lila sat at the edge of the bed, her knees pulled up in the vinyl chair, fingers wrapped around Margaret's wrist, not holding it so much as anchoring it in place. Evan stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw clenched like he was trying not to cry out loud. Sophie hovered beside the IV pole, her laptop in her backpack, untouched. Margaret's voice was quiet, faint but deliberate. "You finished the room," she said, her eyes fluttering closed between syllables. "That's all I needed." "No," Lila whispered, her throat tight. "There's more," Margaret smiled faintly. "There always is, but not for me. I got what I waited for." She drifted into sleep with a soft exhale, the kind that almost sounded like relief. No drama, no sudden beeping, just the steady sound of machines confirming what they already knew. Later that night, as rain began to fall again outside, she slipped away. No one saw it happen. The nurse found her just before dawn, still and peaceful, one hand resting over her chest, her expression calm in a way that felt earned. The service was small, just as she would have wanted. No funeral home, no slideshow, no floral overkill. Just family and Pastor Lewis standing in the living room where she'd spent so much of her life asking people to please use a coaster. The fireplace crackled. The scent of lemon oil and beeswax polish hung in the air. Someone had cleaned, but not too much. Pastor Lewis stood with his Bible closed in his hands, not reading from it, just holding it like a sign of respect. "She built a place that wasn't just shelter," he said. "It was shape, to love, to grief, to mistakes. She gave you something strong enough to repair. That's its own kind of faith." Evan nodded once, his lips pressed tight. Lila leaned against the banister where the staircase curved, blinking fast but letting the tears fall anyway. Sophie sat on the arm of the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor. There was no casket, not in the traditional sense. She'd asked to be cremated. But the family had insisted on something tactile, something real. They'd chosen a long pine box made by a local carpenter, soft-stained, unvarnished. Inside, Margaret's favorite quilt, the green one with the crooked stitching and the mismatched back, had been folded around the urn like an embrace. Lila stepped forward last. She held a paintbrush in both hands. The bristles were still stained from the attic, the same green she once cursed for getting in her hair. She set it gently beside the urn and whispered, "You built beauty we didn't see." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty, it was reverent. After everyone had gone, Evan lingered in the dining room, the light dimmed to amber. He picked up the scrapbook again, flipping to the page with the letter Margaret had written. The folded page was still tucked there, pressed flat like a leaf under glass. But something new had been added. A typed page, titled only Addendum. No one admitted placing it there. It read, "To the ones who stayed, you found the cracks, and you filled them, not to make it perfect, just to make it hold. That's how houses survive. That's how people do too." He stared at the last line. Below it, faint and unformatted, was a single name. Ellen. Evan turned toward the front door as wind lifted again beneath the eaves. Outside, something scraped gently across the porch. He moved to the window and froze. On the welcome mat sat the old flannel shirt from the attic, neatly folded, bone dry. The house was quiet again, but not in mourning, not entirely. It had settled into something else, something slower, like the long, deep breath after a storm Daniel called them together 2 days after the service. No lawyers, no formal papers and sealed envelopes, just the family, gathered in the living room around the coffee table Margaret had once declared too low to be useful, too stubborn to replace. He wore a tweed jacket with suede elbows, something Evan swore he'd owned since grad school, and carried a worn leather portfolio under one arm. Nora stood behind him, hands gently clasped, her smile soft but unreadable. Evan sat beside Lila on the couch, Sophie curled up in the armchair with a mug of chamomile she wouldn't touch. The fire was lit again, its glow dancing faintly on the hardwood floors. Daniel cleared his throat. "I know there's been a lot," he began, his voice steady but colored with something like reverence. "But Margaret left instructions. Not a will, not exactly. She said she wanted it to be read here, in the house, with everyone." He pulled out a stack of pages, typed, but annotated with Margaret's handwriting in the margins. small notes that trailed like breadcrumbs through the paragraphs. If you're hearing this, he read aloud, then I trust the hard parts are over, and the harder parts have begun. Lila let out a half laugh, half sob. Sounds like her. Daniel smiled faintly. She left the house to all of you, equal shares, no right to sell without unanimous vote. She was very clear on that. She said it was a test she hoped you'd pass, eventually. Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face unreadable. Daniel continued, flipping to the next page. There's a fund, set up over time, quietly. She named it the Ellen Fund for Applied Design. Scholarships, supplies, apprenticeships. It's meant for young people who want to restore homes, not flip them. Who want to learn craft, not just code. Sophie's eyes widened. Grandma did that, Nora nodded. She worked on it with us for years, quietly. She said if the world was going to keep breaking things, someone had to be taught how to repair them right. Lila swallowed hard, blinking back sudden tears. God, she really never stopped planning. Daniel glanced down, then back up at them. She named each of you as co-stewards. You'll vote on grantees, run the review panel, contribute however you can. Sophie set her mug down, untouched. She left us homework, she murmured, not inheritance. Evan turned to look at her, really look, and something in his shoulders softened. For the first time in what felt like years, he smiled without hesitation. She'd say there's no difference. Lila stood and walked to the fireplace, the green paint on the mantel catching the light. Her hands were still stained from touching up a corner earlier that morning. She traced one edge with her thumb. I want to mentor, she said. I want to be part of it, the fund, the students. I've spent so long trying to fix things after they broke, but this starts before the cracks. Daniel gave a small, proud nod. Nora reached forward and squeezed Lila's arm gently. Sophie pulled her legs up under her, voice quiet. Grandma always said love and labor weren't opposites. They were the same motion, just different speeds. Evan looked at Daniel. Thank you for helping her set all this up, for seeing it through. She did the seeing, Daniel said. We just held the flashlight. For a moment, the room was silent but full, heavy with memory and something warmer than grief. Then Evan glanced toward the hall, toward the sideboard where the scrapbook still lay open beside the candle they hadn't relit since the night of the letter. I want to read something, he said, rising slowly. From Ellen's letter, or whatever it was. Lila furrowed her brow. You sure? Evan nodded. It's not just about the past anymore. It feels like it's here, still unfolding. He stepped into the hall and stopped cold. The scrapbook was closed, the letter gone. In its place, a single page folded in half, unlabeled. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy. A young woman, 20s, maybe, standing barefoot in the attic, covered in sawdust, laughing. Behind her, on the beam, the words, "This house remembers," carved into the wood. Lila appeared beside him. Is that? But Evan didn't answer, because under the photo, in looping blue ink, was one more line. Check under the floorboards, north wall, before the first frost. The floorboards still creaked in the same places. That was something Sophie insisted on, not fixing the groans of the house. It talks to us, she'd say, half joking as she led a group of wide-eyed teens through the narrow hallways. And after everything it's seen, we owe it the right to complain. It had been 6 years since Margaret's death, 7 since the first letter. The family had stayed. Not always under the same roof, not always in the same rhythm, but always connected by the weight and gift of what was left behind. The house had evolved, the way anything alive does. The back sunroom had become a studio space with easels lined along the windows. The old pantry converted into a reading nook, and the attic, once drafty and half forgotten, now home to storytelling nights and hands-on design classes. On Tuesday evenings, voices would rise through the rafters, a warm, layered hum of narrative and laughter. People came with nothing but words, and left with something stitched back together in them. That was Sophie's doing. She ran the Ellen Fund now, full-time. Built it out of the bones her grandmother left. Added outreach programs, internship placements, and a community archive. Her emails signed off not with best or warm regards, but with a simple phrase, repair forward. That afternoon, she stood in the front yard adjusting the sandwich board sign while the breeze lifted the hem of her shirt. The chalk letters read, Painted History's Workshop, today at 4 p.m. A group of middle schoolers spilled off the sidewalk behind her, led by Lila, her tool belt slung confidently around her hips, like she'd worn it all her life. Lila had become that kind of legend, the patient kind, the kind who turned rusty nails into trust and showed angry kids how sanding could be a kind of peace. She taught with her sleeves rolled up, always with a story tied to whatever broken hinge or miscut trim she handed them. Don't chase perfect, she told them. Chase solid. That's enough. Out back, Evan knelt in the garden bed, the same patch where Margaret once sat sipping tea in silence, not in rest, but in contemplation. Now, tomatoes grew beside marigolds, and snap peas climbed a handmade trellis crafted by one of the early Ellen Fund apprentices. He wore a battered straw hat and hummed softly to himself, more at ease than he ever thought he'd be again. Inside, in what used to be the dining room, a small bronze plaque hung next to the mantel. This home stands for listening. The words had come from a journal found under the north wall, sealed in a tin box with more photos, a handful of pressed flowers, and a final note from Ellen, the real Ellen, the woman whose letters stitched the past into the present. It had confirmed what they'd suspected, that Margaret had not written alone, that the wisdom in her words came from a lineage of women who learned and passed down and repaired. That night, after the workshop ended and the kids had gone home paint-streaked and grinning, the family gathered on the porch, Evan in his gardening gloves, Lila with her thermos, Sophie holding a stack of freshly submitted essays from fund applicants. The house glowed behind them, warm and lived in. Nothing pristine, everything loved. Sophie flipped through the top essay, then glanced out over the yard where the wind danced through hanging lights. She looked at her family, aging, evolving, still here, and she spoke the truth that had been building in her since the first time she read her grandmother's letter aloud to a room full of strangers. She didn't leave us revenge, Sophie said softly. Just responsibility. They all sat with that, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, the kind that roots. From inside, the old clock chimed. Evan smiled. Still a beat off, he said. No, Lila said. I think it's right where it should be. Sophie stood and stepped back inside the house. She paused near the stairs, running her hand along the smooth banister, freshly sanded by a student just last week. She turned, her voice calm but certain. Narration, or memory, or maybe just prayer. She once heard, I'll redecorate this place once she's gone. Instead, she taught us how to live inside our gratitude while she was still here. And upstairs, in the attic, something shifted. A soft creak, a drawer opening on its own, and a gust of cedar sweet air, warm as breath.